Hello everyone and welcome back to another book review. Today I am going to be reviewing Embroiderers by Kay Staniland. This is part of the Medieval Craftsmen series, which I have been reading and reviewing. They're very brief 60-page introductions to a particular medieval craft where we look at examples, some of the technique, and the history. I have been really enjoying them. They're a little older series published in the early 1990s, but I think there's still a lot of great content in these books to enjoy. So I'm going to be going over what you can expect, what the contents of this book are, so what you can expect if you purchase or read it, and then I'm going to give my thoughts of this book overall so that you know what I think about this book compared to other books that I have read. So let's jump in. First, I think it's important, and the author of the book also thinks it is important, is to define the definition of embroidery. So embroidery isn't weaving in the sense of building a garment like this. It would be adding decorative elements. If I were to take this, and this is called the ground, and to add decorative elements like pearls or stitching that gave some decoration and artistic flair to this, then I would be doing embroidery on what was called the ground, which would be this like base material that I have on. So that is the craft that is being done in this book and that is being discussed in this book. The second thing, which kind of makes this craft stand out and comes up again and again in this book, is the number of women who were employed in this craft. Now, women, probably accepting the most noble of people, worked throughout the Middle Ages. There was a daily grind of survival. Things were not as luxurious as they are now. We have quite a high standard of living, I would say, now compared to the Middle Ages. However, there was still professions that women couldn't enter or didn't enter as frequently. So some of these other books that I'm reading that talk about things like manuscript illuminators, glass painters, other professions were more male dominated or were closed off to women. So with that in mind, it's very unique that we have a profession like embroiderers, which is very much open to women. Women were highly valued and had high skill in this profession, and most notably, it was an acceptable occupation for noble women to engage in, and it was something you could do when you had downtime. So with all this being said, there was a heavy emphasis on women in this occupation in a way that I haven't seen in other books, and that was just of interest to me and comes up again and again. So now that we have the definition of embroidery and this unique position where women are actually talked about, discussed, we know the names of, and they're working in this profession, let's dive into the book. I'm just going to go through the contents as laid out in the book to discuss what is discussed and what I found most interesting, and then I will give my thoughts overall. So we first have the early embroiderers. Embroidery was not invented in the Middle Ages. We actually don't really know where it comes from. It's something that's been part of human history for a long, long time. So this was not unique in the Middle Ages. This book just focuses on specific techniques that were found in the European Middle Ages and different techniques that could be displayed during that time. So we quickly move into part two, which is the guilds. So guilds are formed of different people who are working in the same occupation to protect their own interest and to maintain a high quality of work. There's an example in this chapter about a guild that was formed in France, designed to protect the apprentices, designed to make sure that the apprentices being apprenticed were receiving high quality education, to make sure that the standard of work was sufficient. So work had to be reviewed and you couldn't work at night, which was very specifically called out. And this was called out because the level of detail and accuracy that you could get by candlelight wasn't sufficient versus what you can get by daylight. So they needed to restrict working hours to daylight time, which if you think about, if you live in an area that daylight time fluctuates throughout the year like I do, you can range from it being perfectly light outside all the way until 9 or 10 p.m. at night to the sun going down at 4 in the afternoon. So the working time would definitely vary throughout the day if restricted to daylight, but this was done by the guild to ensure that you could produce high quality work. There was also restrictions on things like working on certain days of the week, and there were fines if you were found breaking this, half which went to, I believe it was the king, or some other group, and then half which went to the guild to kind of pay the wages of the people who were in charge of inspecting this. So guilds were important to protect interest, to maintain standards, and to create working conditions that they felt were conducive. And guilds are something we see in all sorts of different medieval crafts, not just embroiderers, but this is one where we have clear examples of them forming guilds to protect their own interests. Next, we move into a chapter that I found a lot of overlap with other books that I have been reading. This was the designers chapter, and there's a lot of overlap in discussion on the people who did the designs that were going to be embroidered were not always the people who were doing the embroidery, which is something I had never thought about before. And the author made a comment that perhaps there was some overlap with the people who did the designs in the embroidery and the designs of medieval manuscripts, but that isn't confirmed. I had never thought about, though, I'm just going to show you some inside pictures from this book while I talk. I had never thought about the fact that maybe the design was done separately from the embroidery, I have to be honest, but it may have been, and that's something that people who are researching this field looked into. The next two chapters are very similar. They are focused on production and techniques. The production is really focused on the output that is done, and something to note from this chapter, and this is another recurring theme in this book, is how the art form that we are looking at, the embroidery, inherently much of it has decayed. A lot of this hasn't been saved, and we'll get into that when we talk about the epilogue section, which discuss what kind of happened to these products, but they were closed, they wear out, they get eaten, they get destroyed, and so a lot of this information that we are gleaning has to be gleaned from texts written for this time, like instructional texts, or we have to rely on paintings or illustrations in books to give us information about what people were wearing and how these were produced. So by nature, we don't actually have a lot of garments from the Middle Ages left. We do have some that are on display, but if you think about it, you probably don't have a high priority of preserving that t-shirt that you're wearing. And of course, we live in a very different time. We can produce garments much quicker than we could in the Middle Ages, which I think leads to a disposability level to our clothes, which I think is not fantastic, I have to admit. I think that's a whole different conversation about maybe we have too much of a disposable culture. But these clothes, which weren't necessarily disposable in the same way, but would be worn to the point where they were worn through, where they'd be recycled, and then they're no longer in their form. So a lot of this has decayed away, and we have to turn to alternative means to learn about this form. The technique section was the book that was hardest for me to understand because I do not know how to sew. I do not know how to do embroidery, cross stitch, yarn, crocheting, knitting. I don't know how to do any of that. I am the least creative person on the planet, I have to admit. I wish I knew how to do any of that. It also is not very interesting to me to learn. But there's a part of me that when my button falls off, I wish I didn't have to ask someone else to sew it back on. I think it's a handy skill to have, and it's one that I don't have. But this is relevant to this book because the technique section just dives right into explaining techniques. Now, I want to warn you, if you get this book, to not make the mistake I did. I don't know any of the different stitch terminology, so I was very lost throughout this section as discussing many different techniques with embroidery. I had to reread sections many times and look at examples to try to figure out what was going on. I reached the end of the book, page 70, and some of the stitches are explained, and I wish this had either been reproduced in the chapter or maybe it was referenced and I missed it, because this would have been very helpful. So don't do what I did when you're reading that section on technique. Don't forget to reference the section on page 50 right above the glossary and across from the further readings page to give you more information about the different stitching, because I was having to put things together in my head and trying to remember when there was an easy reference on page 70 that I just forgot about. The technique was, for me, quite heavy to read through just because I had no familiarity with the topic. But I think if you have basic sewing skills, which sadly I do not, you will probably be easier for you to understand. However, even if you're like me and you're struggling through some of the technicalities, it's very easy to see and appreciate the level that the people were able to obtain. Now, I'm not sure if this is just because when it's cold and dark and you don't have a phone with internet, I guess you're sitting down and doing some embroidery for a while, but the level of detail they were able to obtain in these is absolutely stunning when you stop and think about all the individual stitches that had to be done to create this detail. The longer you look, the more interesting and technically impressive the pieces of work get. There is a separate section that calls out the later Middle Ages, just things that were occurring as the Middle Ages kind of moved and flowed into the Renaissance and as the Reformation occurs. So that does get its own little feature. And then we move into a section on patrons. So the patronage system was in use with embroidery. So many people, if they were of not a noble class, let's say peasants or people who were just working for survival, would not have the funds, the means, or the time to add elaborate, extensive embroidery onto their clothing or create massive tapestries. These were things that were commissioned by a patron who would pay for these items and who would be able to fund this sort of craft occurring. This, of course, means that we have a smaller number of individuals who are kind of directing the craft. At the top of that, in many of these countries, would be the king, the queen, and what they requested, but then also a few other wealthy individuals who could really direct this, while most other people didn't have that sort of resources available to them to request these ornate garments, especially at the beginning of the Middle Ages. Because then we move into the Epilogue, which kind of explains how this trailed into the 1600s and 1700s. The clothing, as we became, we being the human race, were able to better mass produce garments, and as people got more free time, as we were freed up from some of the and this is a gradual process over hundreds and hundreds of years that I would argue is still continuing into today, as we're freed up from having to work for food every single day, and as more and more garments hit the recycled market. So as these garments that used to be at the top level kind of got worn out, they would enter this recycling market in which they would be used at lower and lower levels. So people began, the quality that people became to expect from clothes started to rise, and there was an increase in the number of fabrics and materials available on the market. So more and more people were able to engage in this, and people, if they had time, would be able to add their own decorative elements now at home, which maybe was something they weren't doing before. So over all of this, the embroidery kind of trickled down in a sense, and I'm sure the book did kind of become very vague at this point as we moved into the Renaissance period and moving into 1700s, 1800s, of course into current day, as a whole different textile history book. But it did kind of show that as these garments fell out or became used at the top level, they would move into the recycled level, and that kind of changed the desires or what people were wearing in the lower levels. Also of interest, though, was many of these tapestries, particularly in an area like France, where anything that was praising the king was to be destroyed, were found to be under fire. Fire, metaphorically or physically, could be burnt. The Bayeux tapestry, one of the most recognizable tapestries, was actually slated to be pressed into, it was like military service as a tarp cover, until some people decided to save it. It actually only survived the French Revolution because it was relatively unknown. So there were plenty of times where things could have been destroyed that we have today that weren't, but that also means there are plenty of other items that were actually destroyed during the intervening years from the Middle Ages to now. Additionally, a lot of the most beautiful embroidery would include things like gold or pearls. So you can imagine what happened with that. In some of these cases, the garments were literally disassembled to access the gold or the other precious gemstones or semi-precious gemstones that were located in the clothing. So a lot of this has been destroyed in that time, so we have very little left, and that's where we're having to rely on these other documents, pictures, other sources to show what we know about embroidery in the Middle Ages. Overall, the more I read this book, the more I was impressed with how much they could replicate despite having so few physical artifacts remaining. That was what was most impressive to me, how much they were able to build from other sources. You could tell the author really understood the topic. I did think that that last section, the epilogue section, really left a lot to be desired. I felt like there could have been a lot more built up around that section and more smoothly transition. But I mean, the author is working with like a 60-page time limit. I'm sure that was not a reflection of the author's knowledge on the topic. I think it was more to do with an editorial constraint of having to fit it in these 60-page introductions. But that definitely was something that I felt like could have been a little cleaned up. The book was well spread over the entirety of Western Europe, which I think was good. Some other books in this series have been heavily concentrated, particularly on Great Britain. So I feel like the spread was pretty good. I would have loved more color pictures. I feel like a lot of them, again, are in black and white. This is a feature or a problem I have with the book. I think it was a cost-saving measure to not replicate everything in color. This book was written in the early 1990s, but I feel like with embroidery, I wish I had seen some of the color a little bit more. In many cases, the pictures are reproduced in black and white, and I feel like something is kind of lost when you're unable to see the colors behind it. Overall, it was an enjoyable book. It was a good introduction. I feel like there were some little things that I had some qualms with, but overall, it was a introduction to a topic that I hadn't really thought about, and I left very impressed, having seen lots of examples of exceptional embroidery that has survived from the Middle Ages, and made me really appreciate also the ease of access to which I have clothing today, which is definitely completely different from the clothing that was accessible and available, and the ease of accessibility of that clothing in the Middle Ages. Overall, it was a good book. I would love to hear if you have any books that you would like to recommend. I actually would love to read more books on like textile history, but I want to read more books on everything and I just don't have time. I think there might be one on my TBR that I need to get to, but this book definitely pushed or piqued the interest of that topic to me, and I would definitely be open to exploring more books on this topic in the future. As always, please put your thoughts and comments in the comment section down below. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.